what is the main difference between, let's say, those entrepreneurs who are able to cross this unicorn mark? What was that special about you?
I don't think I'm a better salesperson than the guy that sells my newspaper at the robot when I drive from my house every day. I have the online subscription, but I'll still buy the paper because the man is selling.
Whenever we talk to founders, CEOs, there are few qualities that we look for, right? And none of it is hard skills.
How do we make professional learning brighter or better? My first 10 customers bought our product for 10 different reasons.
How did you get your first check? You remember that? Hi, everyone. My name is Vladimir. I'm a senior partner at E3 Capital. Today, myself and Paras, we invited Melvyn for another episode of our podcast to talk about what it costs to build a business in Africa.
No, thank you, Vlad. Thank you, Paras.
Welcome, Melvyn.
Welcome, Melvyn. So, Melvyn, you flew here from where?
I flew here from South Africa. Took a very early KQ flight, but glad to be here.
Okay, welcome. Hopefully you came exactly for our podcast.
I mean, no better time and no better place to be.
Did KQ treat you nicely? Was it on time?
See, that's a tough question. All views mentioned are not against KQ, but we were a few hours late.
That's they live by the motto, pride of Africa.
But that being said, I did arrive at a more reasonable time of the day, so that's okay.
Perfect. Welcome.
Thank you.
So, Melvyn, tell us about yourself. Where are you coming from? And what do you do? How and what are you doing here in Nairobi?
Yeah, so actually just an African child. My parents are actually Ugandan, so actually quite close to home right now. But I grew up in South Africa. Ultimately, what I've been doing for the last, actually over a decade now, has been building the technology space. And so I'm really passionate about solving problems with technology. And so that's kept me grounded. But coming from an African home, technology entrepreneur wasn't necessarily the dream job for our parents. And so I'm probably the black sheep of the family right now. Hi, Mom.
Perfect. And, you have a very interesting career. You worked at places where many people from different markets want to work. Investment banking, management consulting, and then you became an entrepreneur. How did you manage to get such a nice kind of, how did you get to those places? Tell us a bit more about, like, where did you study, and maybe how did you get to those blue chip places?
That's interesting. So as I mentioned, I grew up in South Africa, and I was very fortunate to receive scholarships for both high school and undergraduate and postgraduate, ultimately, academic scholarships. And so I studied at the University of Cape Town, studied actuarial science and under business science there. But in Finance 1, we're doing, I think it was like DCF 101. I don't know how you go from doing a DCF to like having an asset manager like a Warren Buffett or Alan Gray in South Africa. And so a few friends and I said like, look, we have to like start our own investment company. And so we actually began on Friday nights having IC meetings, reading like, Intelligent Investor, Snowball, trying to bridge the gap between our DCF we're learning and Finance 1.
Yeah, theoretical knowledge.
Exactly. And, we took our life savings at the time, which was probably less than like, $10,000 collectively. And we began to invest. And I think it was there where I really enjoyed getting to understand businesses from that perspective. And so we began investing in listed stocks. And so one of my partners I brought onto that particular business went on to join Goldman Sachs in London, and he was actually a year ahead of me. And he was like, look, Melvyn, you think you'd love this place? You really enjoy it. Like, come check out Goldman Sachs. And so spent some time there with the team in London. And so that was my first experience there. And then interesting thinking about banking, though, was I always wanted to be closer to the operations and the action. And so I then came back, and BCG was opening their first office in Africa. I was the Boston Consulting Group then. And it's interesting, when you're interviewing for a company, trying to be a good student, I remember they asked me, do you have any questions for us? And I was like, yeah, what's the culture of the office? And they were like, well, you've met half the office today. So. And so it was great being in an entrepreneurial environment like a BCG, but we were obviously green in Africa because we were mostly in Europe and so forth. And so it was interesting working with organizations across Africa, but mostly multinationals. And so that was just fun. I remember I moved to Nigeria once, and it was a very like $1 billion listed company in America. And the then head of Africa asked me, what do you think we should be doing in Nigeria and Kenya? And I was like, with my then 22 years of emerging market experience as a consumer, I was able to advise how to think about their particular brands. But I think for me, it's always been very fortunate to be in those environments where you can learn. I think definitely banking and consulting gave me a tool set to think about the business perspective, and also spend some time across the continent, which I really enjoyed. And that gave me the foundations for the tech business we ultimately built.
Yeah, and Melvyn, I mean, you have a similar story to me. So I did investment banking in London, and I remember when I moved 10 years, I reflected to myself, and a lot of people told me that you're crazy moving back to Kenya. If I were you, I'd stay in London, and I have my own journey. But what is that thing in your head that made you move back to Africa?
Funny thing is, so in London, many of the people I used to meet and the senior partners, and sadly, look, I think in Africa, our best export are our people.
Yeah.
And so there are a number of Africans doing incredibly well, especially in banking in London and US. And like Melvyn, as a young, particularly black African in South Africa, why are you not like back home?
Yeah.
And like, it's a good question, but I thought we were here to like also do well for ourselves.
Yeah.
But I definitely found for myself, it was the realization that, look, we're all international, we can be very comfortable where we find ourselves, but I never wanted a world where my kids would ask me where home is and I had no conception of home.
Yeah.
Or I'm pointing to some, Santon or some city. And so I was like, look, let me actually spend more time on the continent. But also that's where I want to have my long-term impact.
Yeah.
So like my career objective is to create 100,000 jobs.
Yeah.
Across our companies, we have under 2,000, so got a very long way to go.
Yeah.
And so it was more so you can't defer the impact you want to have on the ground. But I mean, definitely, it's easy to look at your friends, but like my friends in banking used to see us in consulting flying first class, and they're like, I wish I was doing that. And the guys in banking and consulting were like, oh no, I wish I was in banking because of the bonuses. And entrepreneurs are like, oh, you guys have stable cash flow. I think ultimately it's about saying what's your own path. And I think for me was thinking about the continent differently.
Yeah, I mean, you're fortunate that you realize at 23, 24. It took me a lot longer to realize I needed to come back home. So kudos to you.
So now you are a successful management consultant.
Yeah.
You're an investment banker, and pretty much you're done. You're happy now, right? So parents are proud probably. So now you decide to drop everything, become an entrepreneur. How did it happen?
Yeah, it's interesting. I always feel like if I wasn't in corporate or like in full business, I think I'd appreciate the journey of building, because you can always romanticize the other side until you've done it. And I really enjoyed it. I mean, I'm so grateful for my partners and mentors at BCG because they really pushed me to think about things differently. But the first business which he built out was Go1, which is a tech company which I'll share more on. But it was actually based on my experience in both those settings. So when we began our fund in undergrad, when all the team began working, our companies in compliance didn't care about the stocks they're trading. Imagine a grad saying wants to put in a trade for a company that's listed that's covered by the company. They were like, no, don't care about your trade, stop trading. And so we actually unwound our listed portfolio and began to focus on more micro PE and VC. And so it was interesting then asking some of our early tech investments, like, for example, like Yoko in South Africa, you ask them, what's your biggest challenge? And their biggest challenge was being able to find employees with the right kind of skills as a startup in Africa. And then when I was working in BCG, many of the problems that we were solving for our customers were often a result of companies not investing in their staff. So, you went into a new market, should we buy, build, or partner? Should we make our workforce redundant because not feature fit? And yet, when you looked at the tools that we're using to train their staff, it left much to be desired. It was generally not the sexiest online training that we typically underwent as consultants entering the companies. And so it was weird where I thought the small guys say they can't afford to train their staff, they learn the job. The big guys, all the money, can't get it right. I said, clearly something's broken in terms of how we think about learning on the job. And so I was fortunate to get a scholarship to Oxford, and that's where I did a double master's with my second master's in technology. And it was there when I started to unpack my views on the wall on what learning could look like differently.
Yeah.
And so our first business was one I started with friends, but particularly a classmate of mine at Oxford, which was in the learning space. And the key premise there was, how do we make professional learning brighter or better?
Interesting. And how did you meet, what was your role in that company, that business you co-founded?
Yeah.
So how did you meet your co-founders?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I guess of the founding team members in the business, there were 5 of us. And so the Andrew, who was our CEO for a very long time and our founding CEO for the first 10 years, he was on the same scholarship as me, also the Rhodes Scholarship, and he was my classmate at Oxford for my master's. Prior to that, he'd built a software development house with his high school friends. So other co-founders or partners in the business were actually his high school friends who built a web development business with. And the key premise was they were seeing more interest for learning technologies. And I was telling Andrew, having a services business, coming from consulting, where, you're almost 3 months away from bankruptcy because the project goes and then you're like, fixed costs, and you're looking around. I was trying to say, Andrew, like, look, let's think about a product more seriously. And so at the outset, funny enough, when we began, everyone was doing a bit of everything. I mean, and then I think once we had a conversation, so the story was we came together, started building out some learning solution, and we quickly realized that there's something there, and we wanted to expand globally. And we realized that for tech, US was the market. Unfortunately, being an Australian, South African, none of us really had access to the US, and so we said let's roll the dice and applied for Y Combinator. And it was during the Y Combinator process where we said, like, look, how do you want to build the business and who will do what in the business? And so at this point in time, none of us really liked sales. I mean, we're like just geeks and nerds. But then I guess I was probably the least technical person in our team. And so essentially how we structured then was, so fine, Andrew would be CEO, I'd take care of revenue, Chris Hood, our other co-founder, would take over technical. And then Chris Egland was then head of support. And then Vu, who's a medical doctor, was actually completing his studies at the time. And then he came on board on the sales side as well with me. So essentially, my focus was revenue, go to market, for the first few years.
Understood.
Yeah, interesting. And while I hear you talk, something sprung in my mind because we read a lot of these success stories where you have these college dropouts who create billion-dollar companies, right? And the fact that you mentioned that you work at Goldman and BCG gave you a strong foundation to then apply it in your startup. What's your school on thought about that? I mean, do you think, especially tailored to more towards Africa, is it experience versus naivety, for lack of a better word? Yeah.
I think, and your context around grounding in Africa is so important because I think for so when we did Y Combinator, building in the US and other countries, many people do have a safety net that if their business doesn't fail, they can go back to their families. Yeah. Or for many people, they are the breadwinner in their family. Mm-hmm. And so the question comes down to how much do you put on the line and risk to be able to achieve your goals? And so I think it is a bit more difficult in the African context to think about, like, look, how do I then go and become, let's say, an entrepreneur and take that particular risk? And it was a bit difficult, I think. If I think about my household, so I'm the only non-doctor. And so, like, this is like, okay, Melvyn, you're fortunate to have got scholarships, but,
you're still not a doctor.
Not yet. They're also giving me an honorary doctorate, let me know. But definitely, I think for me, the tricky thing is trying to navigate that. But I do think that one can also learn outside of the formal environment. Right. I think the reason why you can get billion-dollar edtech companies is because the system is broken. Yeah. I just think it's about also getting base skills, like, business language, understanding finances, understanding the basics, which, to be fair, you can get from watching YouTube videos today. Yeah. And so I'm not adverse to formal training or going to a corporate job, but I think it's also important to also be smart in how you take the risk-adjusted approach to get there. Yeah.
So you talked a little bit about hard skills. Yeah. You talked a bit about the risk return. What about EQ? Right? Because a lot of building businesses around EQ.
100%.
And how did you inherit that or learn that then applied, or is it that you just learned on the job?
So I briefly mentioned that in the founding team, none of us really wanted to do sales until you realize that everything is about sales, whether you're like trying to close an investor, bring on a customer, grow your team. But obviously EQ is more than sales. I think I was very fortunate growing up. So my mother is one of 36 kids.
Okay.
Wow. And so my grandfather was amorous. Yeah. And so from that perspective, in our home, there's always been a sense of community. Yeah. And so one of those big on celebrating, bringing the family together, bring all sorts of relatives to come to the fore. I think growing up, I was exposed to, I guess, people from different backgrounds to myself. Yeah. I think that gave me a deeper understanding to be able to navigate that. And I think EQ is obviously, again, more broader than that. But I'd probably argue it's probably the most important skill to do well in life. It's not about business. Yeah. Because ultimately, people invest in people. People work for people. People partner with people. Yeah. And so if you are a person who is likable, can read the room, actually brings out the best in people, I think you'll go a lot further. And that's true in corporate or with an entrepreneur. And I think the good thing about the world is that the feedback mechanism can be quite harsh if you don't have good EQ. Yeah. Because you just realize that, hey, we aren't growing, people don't invest in us, we aren't hiring the right kind of people. And so I think that's an important skill set. I think it can't be taught, but there's so many resources out there. I mean, I'm a big believer in reading biographies and so forth. And, even Warren Buffett hasn't had a biography, but he's very big on saying, like, look, a book that transformed his life was Dale Carnegie's Winning Friends and Influencing People.
Yeah.
Because he was a bit like nerdish and so those kind of resources are out there and so readily available.
Yeah.
And that just helps even some of us deep, statistic nerds to get there. And I think that's a skill that everyone can invest in.
Yeah, I think the one thing, so I'm again, I have a pretty similar background to you, right? So, as an African, we're not as good as salesmen as the US, right? I don't think anyone in the world is, right?
It's true.
So, at one point, so I started reading, okay, how can I sell better? And what I realized, and it's not until you grow older that you gain the confidence that sales is also, it's important to have your own style,
Yes.
right? And not try and copy someone else's style. And you look at Vlad, or myself. If we try to copy an American style of selling, I will fail miserably, right? So I think its style is also relevant when it comes to sales and EQ as well.
Talking about EQ, at E3 in general, if we see more than 3 founders in a team, they're quite concerned. Actually, we haven't seen this working.
Yeah.
Typically, if there is more than 3 founders, even with 3,
Yeah.
someone will fight, and the problem is not with the product, not with the business, it's just people fight.
Yes.
And people disagree. And the more people in the room, it's more likely that people will disagree.
Yeah.
How was this? What's your view on this, like in general?
Yeah.
Having done what you've done, and how was it for you with 4 other co-founders?
It's interesting, even like now as an investor, it's interesting. I've never 3. Okay, fine. 3 is probably a good number for me. 2 is workable. I think 1 sometimes can be a concern.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's less about, because obviously founders play different roles in the business. Because as businesses grow, you could literally be just, I don't know, the support person and be a founder in the business, as opposed to being a C-suite person. I think founders more so a reflection of where you were when the company began. But I think what I like to see in entrepreneurs and even our teams when we built them out was, what are the key roles in the business? Like, where does the buck stop?
Yeah.
Like, who's actually making that founder decision? Because I think often founders aren't able to make the tough decision of saying, like, look, we're both friends, we're both equal partners in this business. Slicing the pie, YC, make it equal, all that good stuff. But in the same vein, who's actually CEO? And what's your role? What's your responsibility? How you hold accountable? And I think for me, founders who are able to show us that, or when I think about investing, are the ones that excite me. So it's less about the numbers. Because look, even on the go-on side, if you think about our founding team, there are 5 of us, which is a lot. But we're very clear on who had particular roles in the business, who was CEO, who was leading us. And we all agree to that. Because otherwise, to your point, you can get in a wheel of like, everyone wants to make a decision, oh yeah, but this. And that's why in any company, you want to separate out your shareholding versus your directorship versus your employee role in the business.
Yeah.
And know which hat you're wearing in each conversation.
Yeah.
And so I think it can work because if they're complementary skill sets, I think for me, the building journey can be so tough. There were days, when you think to ourselves, okay, fine, we tried this venture thing, we tried this entrepreneurship thing, go back to my mother's house, she'll understand that I tried my best and start again, I've got some degree. Obviously, as you get bigger, it's tougher because now you have employees and stuff. But I think when you're feeling down, the hope is that your partner feels up and you balance each other out, because it's a lonely journey if you aren't. I hear your point of being too many people, but I believe it is workable if they're clear roles and there's a clear sense of what value each person brings.
And alignment, right? Alignment's super important. Yeah. Because if you're aligned on the overall objective, you trust your co-founder or your partner to make a decision, because you can question his decision, but you won't question his motive.
That's so true. I mean, so when you're building out Go One, so Go One, when we built it, and just for context, so Go One is the business which we built, and so Go One is like the Spotify for corporate learning, and so you can think of it. So probably one of the world's largest online corporate training libraries. So we aggregate training content, summaries, videos, courses, into one subscription, and then offer that to organizations in more than 60 countries. And so that's where we are today. When we began as a learning management system. Almost think of us like a bookshelf, without any books. Whereas now we sell more of the books that go into people's bookshelves. And on that journey, we always knew that we existed to help people unlock their positive potential through a love for learning. But I mean, don't forget that, like, on the journey, to your point, we always thought about different twists and turns. And at some point, we were thinking about, should we create a conference aggregation tool? Because back in the day before COVID, you'd speak to a customer, they'd be like, hey, can you do online training? They'd be like, no, we do conferences, we want our per diems, we want to leave the office. And we're like, clearly everyone's spending their money on conferences, it's aggregate conferences.
Yeah.
And so when we have those meaningful debates, not saying that, hey, we want to build a different business, but because we all were aligned on what impact we wanted to achieve in the business and where we're going, we could have robust conversations without the interest of saying, but no, someone's trying to take us into some other journey.
Absolutely.
And do you think, like, there were five of you.
Yeah.
Do you think it's important to have interests like outside work? Do you need to be actually friends, or it's not important?
I think so being friends is good. I think more importantly is mutual respect and trust. And friendships, the best friendships, have those imbued in them. And to your point, Parison, you're saying like, look, do you trust the person to have your interest? Because the worst thing you can do is be in a work environment where, in rugby, or we say in South Africa, being tackled by your fullback. Like you're literally running to score a try and someone behind you takes you out. And so if you have trust and respect for them, you respect their inputs, their decisions, but in the same vein, you also trust them to make the right decision and be able to have really frank conversations. I mean, so one thing which I really loved was Creativity Inc. Full Katmar, and how they used to think about things at Pixar. And just how I used to manage meetings and bring the best out of the people. I think that really guided us as a team, because whilst we were friends, like we used to have weekly excos, or SLTs as we used to call them shortly, is no one ever felt safe. So yes, when we're hitting sales, for the first 2 years, I think we're growing like, 25% month on month on average. We're doing well. But the reality is that I never went into a exco meeting feeling like I was sick, because I knew my guys were going to push me and be like, hey, what are we doing?
Yeah.
And I think that was good, because we knew we could have those tough conversations and could still be friends thereafter.
Oh, interesting. So, okay, now you're in Y Combinator.
Yeah.
You're successful on paper.
Yes.
How did you get your first check? Do you remember that?
Yeah, so interestingly, our first check actually came from, depends how you sequence it, but it actually came from the Oxford University seed fund, at least when you fully put together the business. So typically when you do Y Combinator, you reincorporate in Delaware, and so we had to create a Delaware C Corp and all the good things there. And we applied for many competitions at that point in time, and we didn't get them, sadly. Back then the company was called Aduro, which means spark in Latin, or like spark, brighter learning. Obviously we're nerds, you can tell.
Yeah.
And so we didn't win any of those. That was the competition trying to win like £5,000. I think I posted on Facebook saying, hey guys, vote for us, whatever. Didn't win that one. But so we then got the Oxford seed funds to come on board and give us, I think it was £10,000 as a part of the YC process. And then we were also able to get the initial YC check as well. Early on, friends and family, yes, credit cards. But our first meaningful check was actually post demo day. So after YC, 3 months, you then have a demo day, and actually garner investment from particular people. And so that was like when you actually start saying like, hey, we actually are going somewhere from that perspective.
Well, what did you feel when you actually got this first check?
It's hard to believe, because you see, demo day is unique because it's almost like after demo day, everyone's excited. Everyone wants to talk to you. It's like, oh yeah, hey, because we had some revenue, because many companies didn't have revenues. Like, hey, you're the one with revenue. You can be like, child, right? And so you feel like, oh my gosh, everyone loves me. Like to the moon, go and watch out Zuckerberg. But the problem is, 2 weeks after demo day is the most quiet time. It's like being on the third page on Google.
Yeah.
I guess it's like, there's no activity. And so getting that first check was very humbling, because it felt as though there's validation on what we're building. Because I think very early on, you look outside for validation.
Yeah.
Customers, the reality is this, and in sales, where if I look at my first 10 customers in Go One, because during then we were trying to call, trying to get guys online, whatever it was. And my first 10 customers bought our product for 10 different reasons. And so I almost felt like, were they buying the product because I was selling them, or because they actually wanted the product and they were solving a pain point? And so having investors that had actually seen things before and saying this is something there, you're like, okay, this is something very exciting. And so that was very humbling to, doing our first check in from that perspective. But also you see the money hit your Silicon Valley bank. Yeah, that was a good times then. Hit your Silicon Valley bank account, and you feel like, hey, okay. And then you realize it's not your bank account, and then you realize it's okay, I'm still grinding away and still loss making at the time. But definitely was humbling, because you realize that, hey, someone's actually putting real money behind your business.
Yeah.
And something which you then also, I feel also creates a little duty of care and how you think about your business.
Yeah.
I think initially it was like, taking shareholder money, and then as you grew the team, it was thinking about the duty of care to our employees and their families across the countries. But definitely, you don't take that for granted.
Yeah. You actually mentioned a very key word, right? So, Vlad and I, whenever we talk to founders, CEOs, there are few qualities that we look for, right? And none of it is hard skills. It's more soft skills around, integrity and stuff like that. But the key one we look at is being humble, right? Because a lot of times ego kills companies, right?
Right.
And it's really important that the founders are humble. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Look, it's also, I think one thing about being in the Valley and building is I remember there were guys in our just the cohort before us, I think, who after like 6 months sold their business to GE, I think 1.8 billion.
Yeah, wow.
And we're like, you thought you're doing well, but then the guy next to you had less revenue.
Yeah.
And I think often, the only way you cannot be humble is to be closed-minded. I think the more open-minded you are, the more you see of the world, the more you realize there's so much more you can do.
Yeah,
And I think that's something which is key.
And so fast forward, it was the first check. Was this a convertible?
Convertible, yes.
Convertible.
Safe.
There was no safe back in
There
the...
was a YC safe, it was.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. And so fast forward, how many funding rounds did you have?
Yeah. So, different funding rounds. I guess we go up to Series D at this point in time, but we did a D1 and D2, so call it 5 fundraising rounds.
Mm-hmm.
So in total, across the life of Go1, raised just over $450 million. So big investors in that have been SoftBank, M12, Microsoft's VC fund, Salesforce Venture has been significant. Madrona, one of the first investors in Amazon as well, was big in our C or D. And so from that perspective, I'm fortunate to have the investors we had. But I came a long way from our first safe.
And so what's the valuation of the business now?
Yeah, so hopefully a lot more than what it's worth now, because I think it's the last valuation of the last round, but the business has grown since then. And so that's been exciting. But the last round we did, the business was valued at well over $2 billion. And so very, very humbling, I think, when you put that into perspective, just given, obviously thinking about the context of the continent. But
Yeah, that's impressive. 2 billion. It's a very important kind of milestone when you cross this line. And in your view, what is the main difference between, let's say, those entrepreneurs who are able to cross this unicorn mark?
Yeah.
What was that special about you?
So I think something special about me and probably my team. And I think not even the team and the founding team, but more the team we're able to build. I think we're very fortunate in building the space we're in because we're able to attract really strong team members who've helped us, carry the vision. We have, now over like 800 employees, and just going on that journey with them has been key. But I think about entrepreneurs that are able to build at the scale that could result in a $1 billion unicorn outcome. It often comes down to, one, their grit. Like, are they willing to go through the trenches and the resilience around that? But also importantly, on what scale are they thinking? I don't think I'm a better salesperson than the guy that sells my newspaper at the robot when I drive from my house every day. I have the online subscription, but I'll still buy the paper because the man is selling.
Yep.
And he's talented. He's got Sales 101, Sandler says he'll take me out. But I think often it comes down to how big is the problem you're solving. So for example, if I was solving a unique problem for the Uganda, South African market in education, I would struggle to get a $1 billion outcome because you can only capture value you create in a market that's big enough for that value to be created. And I think that's where, for us, we're fortunate where education is a hundreds of billions dollar issue and problem. And we're still a startup. Even though we're a big startup, we're still a startup.
Yeah. But I think you should give yourself kudos and your team because we see a lot of founders or companies which have a value proposition that is also strong in other markets, but the vision is a little bit more, it's also about the vision and how big they can think, right? And you guys were, fortunate enough to think big, global.
Yeah. It's interesting. You think about Startup Nation, you're thinking about Israel's ecosystem where I think because the local market's so small, some people are forced to think on day one, think outside your market, think more globally. But so that being said, I find, all of us are now, investors and entrepreneurs, is you also have to start, small and you must earn the right to grow big. So almost have a vision, want to know where you want to go and be big, but in the same vein, also don't forget to walk before you run. Yeah. I think because what I also see sometimes is entrepreneurs, they have a big vision that they forget about the foundations of actually building a business. Yeah. And so it's yes, high plan, let's go into that market, I've raised capital, now let me go burn. And the way to burn money is to go hire sales guys without understanding the market. I mean, everyone does it. And so I think something which is, to your point, that fine balance, and also being humble enough to learn. Yeah. Because the same way we began as a learning management system, then we ended up being a content subscription to being an aggregator. I think you have to almost be very akin to be vulnerable and understanding look, you'll get things wrong, you'll make mistakes. I mean, none of us had built businesses before. None of us had been in Silicon Valley either. And so, you pay lots of school fees trying to figure out what's the right go-to-market. How do you hone your product? I think it's that willingness to say, like, look, hey, we want to keep moving forward, just understand our customer. I think many entrepreneurs don't take time understanding their customer, and therefore they aren't solving real problems, but they get stuck in their ways.
Yeah. Or what we see, especially in the African context, instead of having one strong value proposition, they start to think, okay, how do I monetize this customer, right? Instead of making the customer, focusing on, love you. Yeah.
And during the journey, it all sounds very nice, by the way, like a unicorn. Was there a moment when you actually felt it was all going to fail? Or you felt completely down, maybe broke as well? What was the slowest point in that journey, if you can remember it?
I think in hindsight, the lowest points don't seem so low. I think but there were times when, look, early on, cash deposit now, but early on, I mean, where you're riding out of runway, an investor who said they're going to come into a round is now trying to sue you because you didn't want to accept their terms on their term sheet that were different to what they discussed in person. So now you run out of money. There's a big, person that's trying to sue you for not taking their money. And you're like, what must you do? And, there's a movie, and I'm sure every entrepreneur has stories like this. And I think it's something which, in those moments, it's hard because you're like, okay, you think of the opportunity cost. And so I think also where you're like, okay, fine, do I go back to a corporate job or do I stay as an entrepreneur and deal with this? I think for us, it was moments like that where, especially early on, where you are running out of cash, you built a team, there's a good culture. Nothing's wrong with the organization, but your bank balance is the issue.
Yeah.
And you can't change that because none of us can be like, hey, uncle, can you just come and give us a quick bridge there?
Yeah.
And I think for me, that's been the most humbling journey, especially when it comes to fundraising, engaging investors. Because whilst we had strong growth, we weren't a Silicon Valley team. Yes, we had lots of revenue in like the US and stuff, but we weren't building this. It's almost like, we can't back you because of this and that. And I think those were hard times because you look around the table and it's not like you can pull something off the hat.
Yeah.
You can work hard. You can make all the phone calls. You've been a good child. You went to school like a parent did. You worked hard. You did all the good things. But, when an investor changes their ilk and you've, doubled down on them for a particular round, it was very tough for us. And I think, yes, being able to navigate that and we survived that went on strength to strength. But I think that's been the biggest one. And that's why I think for me, I think about building businesses then that entrepreneurs you want to back. You also want to say, how do you enable companies to be masters of their own destinies?
Yeah.
And just think through, because I think back then, Silicon Valley, you grow at all costs.
Yeah.
And so you can rack up those costs very quickly.
Yeah.
Which I find is different. So interesting during COVID, and so it's a very relevant note. So we're having a conversation. So one of our investors is Microsoft.
Yeah.
I had a conversation with Reid Hoffman, and because he has invest portfolios across developed markets and emerging markets. And he was saying during COVID, his emerging market portfolios actually fared better because they actually had leaner operations and were more cost conscious. Whereas in America, there wasn't that diligence.
Yeah.
And so I think that's where we're very fortunate on the Go One side, where even though we're selling into the US, I mean, I used to have guys outside the US selling into the US. So for example, I had like a SDR team in the Philippines because Filipinos sound very American on the phone, but they don't cost the price of an SDR in Silicon Valley, or guys from South Africa dialing into the UK. And so being able to leverage our ability of having bases outside of those bigger markets at the outset was very helpful for us to manage that.
Yeah. And it's not only about cost, right? It's also because access to capital. So in the US, they know that there's a lot of liquidity, they'll get the funding rounds. In Africa, we have probably a fraction, less than 1% probably of the capital that going into American startups. So we have to be reliant on ourselves, right? So it's, and this is, COVID taught us all a lesson, even here in Africa, where we thought we were focusing on bottom line. It just told us that you try and be self-reliant and, like you say, master of your own destiny as soon as possible.
Yeah.
So you don't have these kind of issues.
Yeah, so true.
Yeah.
But it's true. And I think this is where also entrepreneurs and investors need to also be honest with entrepreneurs, because I do find that sometimes VCs will want companies to take more money than they need to take because they want to get a certain economics on the cap table, a certain ownership. I think it is tough for an entrepreneur to be like, hey, I want this amount of money for this, and so I want to build. And I think it's important for us as investors not necessarily shift the goalposts.
Yeah.
Because to be fair, 20 years ago in Africa, you had to actually sustain your business through cash flow from customers.
Yeah.
You couldn't say, hey, investor, come and invest in me, or hey, I'm going to do the startup competition and win that grant and let's go there.
Yeah.
And so I think it's often just going back to business fundamentals, which I think we've had enough for a long time on the continent, but I think often we forget once we take external capital.
Yeah. And then, that saying, that I really believe is very true is that the best companies to invest in are the ones that don't need your money, right? Because they've got that discipline. They don't need it. They take it because of their vision and scaling outside. But yeah.
That's interesting. I can understand from your perspective. I mean, do you find that many Africans want to build for Africa? And if so, do they want to build for Africa? Is it only for their own market? Because in South Africa, for example, many of the companies that we've looked at when we were building out Go One was we realized that Africa may not be the best destination for what we're building at this point in time at the beginning because the market wasn't mature enough.
Yeah.
Whereas, I could go to America or sell to Australia or UK, and because the market was mature, they got it.
Yeah.
Whereas in Africa, I was paying money to be a market maker as well. I was saying, thinking about closing a deal. I remember when I was closing deals, in South Africa, you had to go meet with the person, talk about the schoolwear, rugby, all the stuff. Whereas literally back then, I could go on a go-to meeting and close a deal the same size in America without ever seeing the person.
Yeah.
And something which I always think about when building for Africa and thinking whether one builds outside or builds for the continent specifically.
Yeah.
In your spaces, what do you guys see?
I'll let Vlad answer that.
I think from my perspective, what we've been seeing, as you said, it's all about the ambition, the grit. And again, if you have this ambition as a founder, as an entrepreneur, by definition, you want to go outside your market. So it's never like all the ambitious entrepreneurs who are very successful, they want to go outside their market. However, I believe like most Africans, most African entrepreneurs we meet, they really care about their communities. They really want to make a difference in their country, but they always want to go outside and be big. And I think it's just the nature of this kind of very ambitious entrepreneurs.
No. Good point, actually.
Yeah. I guess, there's two schools of thought. And like you said, no entrepreneur's the same. But I think, the vision's so important. And the vision doesn't need to mean scale, but vision is what's important to you, right? And you have some founders who I've seen are equally successful who focused on one key market, but they've created such a strong value proposition through their product because their vision was to solve the customer's issue. And then soon after they realize, okay, because they've done that so well, that product or service can be exported globally or in emerging markets at least, right? While I've got other founders who think global from day one. So it really depends, right? But I guess the ones who are successful in scaling outside Africa are the ones with a partnership mentality. How do I work with others to go beyond where I am? And you have some founders, and this was in the early days of VC in the continent, where they wanted to completely control the whole value chain, right? Straight from manufacturing to financing. It's insane. But now at least we've got defragmentation in the value chain, which is good. But back then, founders wanted to do everything. But the good founders who expand globally quickly are ones that partner with other people,
So true.
and create a wider base.
No, true. That's actually, Vlad, to your point around co-founders, where partnership begins at the outset of the company.
Yeah.
Like, how do you think about your partners? How do you manage that co-founder relationship? Why that particular person? Is it because you happen to be in the same class in preschool and you just became friends? And so I think often even seeing how people manage that co-founder relationship is a good indication of, are they collaborative and can they work with others as well?
Yeah, exactly. And we always talk about this concept around it's not the ownership stake you have in terms of percentage, it's the pie that you want to grow, right? But that mentality crosses through everything, right? So even when you're having JV conversations, they're so fixated on the percentage, but not on the fact of what are you creating after that? Yeah. And that's like, to your point, that partnership mentality with co-founders is so important, because it's ingrained in the DNA of the company. How do we build something together and not focus on the numbers or small things today?
Yes. It is hard though. In Go One, interestingly, we had a partnership model because we aggregate content, and so we don't create content ourselves.
Yeah.
And we distribute through channel partners like HR platforms and so forth. And so it's interesting where people who often the world saw as our competitors actually ended up being our strongest partners, because 1 + 1 could equal 10, because we had B2B distribution, they had great content, and you're able to find those synergies. So 2 years ago, we acquired a company called Blinkist, a summary company. that like book summaries and so forth. And so it was interesting where they were more B2C. We had a great B2B channel. And when you put a bit of their content into our ecosystem, it was almost as if people loved it.
Yeah.
And so just being able to see that cross-pollination where you could have been like, oh no, yeah, B2C, we're B2B, we don't want this margin, we don't want this conversation. And saying what's the art of the possible, which I find is the only way to really get ultimate success.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think a lot of the acquisitions, a lot of the good acquisitions that happen in today's world is a partnership. It's not, it's not seen as an acquisition.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Melvyn, now you raised money again recently. You read in the news. So now you're an investor.
Yes.
Right? So you're with Breega.
Yes.
Right. Maybe you could just talk us through this transition.
Yeah.
So how you ended up being on the other side of this.
The dark side.
Yeah.
Haven't guessed.
Yeah.
That's interesting, so in the Go One journey, as I mentioned, we probably had 5 successive rounds in the business. At the time, I struggled to find African entrepreneurs or investors that had experience building businesses, but even more so, our first African investor was in our Series D, but they were already a unicorn. And I mean, like, I emailed everyone in 2015 being like, hey, I'm starting this company, we've got some revenue, and everyone didn't get it, or they said, oh, you're losing money, it doesn't make sense. And so back then, there wasn't a strong understanding of VC, particularly from an Africa perspective, or at least building tech businesses back then. And so for me, it was simple. I want to be the investor. I wish I had when I was building my business.
Yeah.
And that goes beyond just the kind of capital, but also the understanding, the empathy of what it takes to get there. And so I've actually, as I mentioned earlier, probably been an investor longer than I've been an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
Because I came from investing very small money and then building and now back to investing. It's really been trying to think how I leverage those learnings. And so ultimately for me, Breega, what's exciting about what we do is that all of us are entrepreneurs or operators, former entrepreneurs and operators. And so we have that founder DNA, but ultimately we exist to partner with entrepreneurs and offer them both the financing, both being a sparring partner, but also to offer them what we call full stack funding, where we actually do have the value add teams to work with them, our scaling squad, but ultimately thinking through how can I also magnify my impact as an entrepreneur? Because for me, partnering with Breega was partnering with a tier 1 leading European fund to actually unlock capital in Africa.
Yeah.
And one thing I really love doing is reading biographies. And if you read the biographies of some of the greats in Africa, whether that's a Oppenheimer, Rupert, even going back to Rhodes, what they did very, very well, even today, like the Strives and the Dangotes of the world, what they did very well is being able to attract international capital and skills into the local market and be a trusted partner for that to be the case. Yeah. And so given my experience, I see that as being my role from that perspective, whilst also backing entrepreneurs.
Yep. That makes sense.
One more question, so you've gone through so many funding rounds, and so probably there was one thing you hated about investors, and maybe fundraising. And so you as an investor, what is that 1 or 2 things that you want to do differently compared to those investors you onboarded at Go One?
Well, look, those who onboarded are all great, so thank you. I think those who didn't onboard, I think one is to give feedback. I think, if someone takes the time to pitch to you and to share their deck with you, I mean, and also you spent the time as an investor analyzing it, so you actually have a view. Yeah. It might be a nice view. Maybe you say the team sucks, I don't like your idea, but you've had a view on the business. So being able to, I think, share feedback is so important. Yeah. And look, it's also hard because I think, it's something which Mike Siebel at YC used to say was understand the no, but not the reason, because someone will say no and the reason won't necessarily match up. Yeah. But I always try to say, look, how can I give feedback that's valuable to them on their business? Because maybe you don't like the team and you can't say, okay, I don't like you as a team, so sorry, I'm not going to invest. But in the same vein, it's about that transparency and paying it forward. I think also, rather a quick no than a slow maybe. Yeah. I think, and it's even hard. I struggle with it now when I think about, because you're saying no a lot, especially at early stage. I mean, so we are seeing, let's call, over 50 companies in a 2-week cycle. And the reality is that you're saying no a lot. Yeah. And so no from me doesn't mean that you're going to not make money and build a big business. And I think it's being able to articulate that. I think many VCs, when I was raising, didn't help me understand what they were solving for. Yeah. And I think that's one is the just giving feedback, also two, having empathy so you understand why am I solving for and why I didn't invest. And just finally trying to be more responsive. Yeah. It's still difficult. And when you're getting that many deals, you're like, look, I want to give feedback, but I also want to get back to the person and say yes or no. I think those in the investment cycle are more important. Yeah. I think once you invest, I think it really is just about being a true sparring partner and being available. Yeah. I think there are many investors we had who, said, oh no, my best friend is CEO of XPE fund and you can get into all our portfolio companies. They made lots of claims, but they never delivered value. Yeah. So saying like, look, where you are as an investor, where can you say, I know someone there, I know there's someone there, but I can help you think through this particular issue?
Yeah.
I think it's about not over-promising what you can deliver from that perspective as well.
I think it's a great point. I personally believe, and it goes beyond just investing, if blunt, sometimes harsh feedback, once it becomes socially acceptable, we'll do better at the planet. Perfect. Melvyn, we have a few quick questions for you.
Yes.
It will be just one answer.
Don't think. It's like a fireside.
World
Yeah.
peace.
Yeah, world peace.
Okay, let's start. I'll start with an easy one.
Yes.
Red or white wine?
White.
Favorite place in the world?
Istanbul.
Okay.
But wait, there's more.
Okay. So, who is your role model, true role model in life?
Warren Buffett, I assume.
My mother.
Your mother.
Okay, well. Yeah.
Running or weightlifting?
Whew, somebody's coming here. It's weightlifting.
Okay. We can see that. If it was not South Africa and you had to move out of the continent, where would you go?
We said out of the continent. Well, Nairobi is good, looking nice right now. Possibly Dubai. Dubai works.
You like it?
Yeah, it's well connected, central, get things done. Yeah.
And no tax. And don't forget that. and coming from South Africa itself.
Tesla or BYD?
That's?
Tesla
Yeah.
or BYD?
Tesla.
Why is that?
Because for all its misgivings, Tesla's pioneered a lot, and I think we forget that. I think they really built a class in the EV space. And don't get me wrong, BYD is doing plenty of stuff now, and Tesla looks like it's a crazy show right now. But DNA matters, and I really back the founder at the top.
Perfect. Melvyn, thank you very much. Thanks for
Thank
coming.
you, Melvyn.
No,
It was
A
great.
pleasure. Thank
Yeah.
you.